Major Douglas Kelley. He is the Army psychiatrist tasked with discovering whether these men are fit for trial.
In 1945, a 33-year-old American psychiatrist was given the most dangerous assignment in history. Sit alone in a prison cell with Hermann Göring, the second most powerful Nazi in the world, and answer one question. Is this man insane, or is he something far worse? What Douglas Kelley discovered in that cell would haunt him for 12 years, until the night he swallowed the same poison that killed his patient. The psychiatrist's assignment nobody wanted. The war in Europe had just ended. Allied soldiers were still clearing rubble from bombed cities when a telegram arrived at a military hospital in France. Major Douglas Kelley, chief psychiatrist for the entire European theater, was being reassigned immediately. His new posting was a converted luxury hotel in Luxembourg. His new patients were the most hated men on earth. The Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains looked peaceful from the outside. White walls, manicured gardens. But in the summer of 1945, the hotel had a new name: Camp Ashcan. A 15-foot electrified fence surrounded the property. Machine gun towers watched every corner. Guards joked that getting inside required a pass signed by God, and then somebody had to verify the signature. Inside those walls sat 22 captured Nazi leaders waiting to learn if they would face trial or simply be executed. Douglas Kelley was not supposed to be here. He was a rising star in American psychiatry. Born in California in 1912, he had earned degrees from UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco by age 21. A Rockefeller Fellowship took him to Columbia University, where he became one of America's leading experts on the Rorschach inkblot test. He literally wrote the book on it. Now, the Army wanted him to study monsters. Before the war, he ran the San Francisco City and County Psychopathic Hospital. He was building a brilliant career studying ordinary patients with ordinary problems. Troubled minds that could be understood, categorized, and sometimes healed. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what waited in Luxembourg. His orders seemed simple enough: determine if the Nazi prisoners were mentally competent to stand trial. Could they understand the charges against them? Could they participate in their own defense? Were any of them legally insane? The stakes could not have been higher. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson had made the Allied position clear. If we just shoot these men, we make them martyrs. The world needed to see justice, not revenge. But justice required the defendants to be sane. If Kelley found them mentally incompetent, the entire trial would collapse. There was another assignment, too, one that was never put in writing. The world wanted to know what made these men tick. Were the Nazis psychologically different from normal people? Was there something broken inside their minds that explained the concentration camps and the gas chambers and the 6 million dead? He arrived at Camp Ashcan in August 1945. He had no experience with war criminals. He had never evaluated mass murderers, but the Army believed his scientific rigor would help him see clearly where prejudice might cloud the judgment of others. Kelley later described the detention center as a psychiatrist's playground. He studied the prisoners the way a biologist might examine animals in laboratory cages. He made daily rounds, visiting each cell, conducting interviews, observing behavior. He performed magic tricks to build rapport. He sat for hours on the edge of prison cots, discussing philosophy, history, and personal memories. But one prisoner fascinated him more than all the others combined. Hermann Göring arrived at Camp Ashcan like a man checking into a resort rather than a prison. Some accounts say he brought 16 suitcases. Others claim 49. Either way, the baggage included ornate jewelry, gold cigarette cases, and enough paracodeine pills to stock a pharmacy. The man who had commanded the German Air Force, who had created the Gestapo, who had been designated Hitler's successor, weighed over 260 pounds and was severely addicted to opiates. Prison Commandant Colonel Burton Andrus took one look at him and saw only pathetic weakness. When Goring came to me at Mondorf, he was a simpering slob with 2 suitcases full of paracodeine. I thought he was a drug salesman." Kelley saw something very different. Within days of arriving, Goring had positioned himself as the leader of the prisoners. Guards found themselves chatting with him about sports and hunting. Officers who should have known better offered him drinks and sang songs with him until an outraged Dwight Eisenhower personally issued a reprimand the next day. This was supposed to be the ridiculous, comical figure portrayed in Allied newspapers, the fat buffoon in the fancy uniforms. Instead, Kelley found himself facing a man who spoke fluent English, who understood psychology, who seemed to anticipate every question before it was asked. The first real conversation between the psychiatrist and the prisoner lasted several hours. Goring talked quickly and at length, but Kelley noticed something troubling. Every answer was couched in general terms. Every response redirected attention toward Goring's importance. The man was performing, not confessing. Then Kelley asked a question that would stay with him for the rest of his life. How could you order the murder of a close associate? Someone you had worked with, dined with, called a friend? Goring stopped talking. He stared at Kelley with what the psychiatrist later described as puzzlement, as if Kelley were not quite bright. Then he shrugged his great shoulders, turned up his palms, and spoke slowly in simple one-syllable words. But he was in my way. That was it. No justification, no elaborate excuse, just the flat statement of a man who saw other human beings as obstacles or tools, nothing more. Kelley walked back to his quarters that night, knowing something had shifted. He had expected to find madness. Madness would have been reassuring. It would have meant the Nazi leadership was an aberration, a collection of broken minds that could be diagnosed and dismissed. What he was about to discover would threaten the idea that evil must look unstable. A mind that refused to break. The formal evaluations began in September 1945. Kelley administered every test in the psychiatric arsenal: intelligence assessments, personality inventories, Rorschach ink blots.
I'm going to show you a series of cards, each with ink blots, and you're going to tell me what each ink blot makes you see.
Structured interviews. Hour after hour, day after day, he probed Goring's mind, looking for the crack that would explain everything. The crack never appeared. The Wechsler-Bellevue intelligence test came first. Goring attacked it with visible enthusiasm, treating each section like a competition. When the scoring was complete, Kelley stared at the number in disbelief. That was number 138. Very superior intelligence. Only about 2% of the population scored that high. Goring was delighted when he learned the result. Then he discovered that two other defendants had beaten him. Hjalmar Schacht scored 143. Arthur Seyss Inquart scored 141. Goring's delight turned to fury. He immediately declared the test unreliable. That reaction told Kelley something important. Here was a man who could shift from charm to rage in seconds, but always strategically. The emotional volatility was real, but it was controlled, deployed, weaponized. The Rorschach sessions proved even more revealing. Kelley was one of America's foremost experts on the inkblot test. He had co-authored the standard manual. He knew how to read responses, how to spot defensive patterns, how to identify hidden psychopathology. Goring had a great time with the Rorschach. He laughed. He snapped his fingers in excitement. He produced vivid, detailed responses to every card. When shown card 2, he saw two dancing men performing a fantastic dance, their hands together like whirling dervishes. The response was well-formed, creative, and completely controlled. At the end of the testing, Goring expressed regret that the Luftwaffe had not had available such excellent testing techniques. Even while being evaluated, he was framing the experience in terms of his own military leadership. Kelley looked for hallucinations. There were none. He looked for delusions. There were none. He looked for breaks from reality, for thought disorders, for the markers of schizophrenia or paranoia that might explain how a human being could oversee genocide. None of it was there. What he found instead was a personality defined by extreme narcissism, ruthless ambition, and complete moral emptiness. Göring did not feel guilt because he did not believe he had done anything wrong. During one interview, Kelley asked about Nazi racial ideology. Did Göring actually believe in the pseudoscientific theories about Aryan superiority? Göring laughed. Nobody believes that rot. Then how could you justify 6 million deaths based on ideas you knew were false? Göring paused. His expression shifted slightly, as if calculating how much truth to reveal. Well, he said finally, it was good political propaganda. That answer contained everything Kelley needed to know. Göring had not committed atrocities because he was deluded. He had committed them because they served his purposes. The ideology was a tool. The deaths were acceptable costs. Kelley spent approximately 80 to 90 hours with each prisoner. The picture that emerged was consistent across every data point. Göring was not insane. He was not delusional. He was not suffering from any diagnosable mental illness. He was simply a man who had been given unlimited power and used it without any moral constraints. The formal verdict was clear and unambiguous, legally sane, free of psychosis, fit for trial. Stability, not sickness, was emerging as the defining pattern. And that pattern led somewhere Kelley did not want to go. If the architects of genocide were psychologically normal, what did that say about human nature itself? The prisoner who became the leader. The Nuremberg prison was designed to break men down. Each cell contained a flush toilet, a straw mattress, a thin blanket, and a small table carefully constructed so it could not support the weight of an occupant trying to hang himself. Guards watched through openings in the doors 24 hours a day. None of it touched Hermann Göring. While other defendants crumbled under the pressure, Göring seemed to grow stronger. He lost weight as doctors weaned him off his drug addiction. His mind cleared. His energy returned. Within weeks, he had transformed from the bloated wreck who arrived at Camp Ashcan into something far more dangerous. A leader. The other defendants noticed immediately. Albert Speer found himself heading what he called the anti-Göring faction. Speer told the prison psychologist that Göring's control over the others must be broken. Even now, I can say more of what I intended to say when separated from him. But separation was difficult. Göring exerted influence without formal authority. He intimidated defendants into voicing statements in his favor in court. He persistently demonstrated his loyalty to Hitler.
Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, was one of the most intriguing men in wartime Germany.
And pressured others to do the same. Some defendants confessed privately that Göring was downright tyrannical. When Robert Ley, one of the other prisoners, committed suicide, Göring showed no emotion whatsoever. He told the psychologist it was just as well that Ley was dead. I had my doubts about how he would behave at the trial. Another obstacle removed. The prison administration finally responded on February 15, 1946. New regulations prohibited any contact between defendants outside the courtroom. The explicit purpose was to eliminate the influence of Hermann Göring on other defendants. Even in isolation, his presence dominated. The American guards were particularly susceptible. Göring became the most popular prisoner because he seemed to take an interest in their lives. He asked about their families. He discussed hunting and sports. One guard recalled that Göring spoke pretty good English, and they would talk about ball games and aviation, and Charles Lindbergh. Lieutenant Jack Wheelis developed an actual friendship with Göring based on their shared passion for hunting. Göring gave him a signed photograph inscribed, "To the Great Huntsman from Texas." He also gave him his gold watch, his pen, and his cigarette case. These were not the actions of a broken prisoner. These were investments, strategic generosity designed to create loyalty and options. One conversation particularly struck Kelley. He asked Göring how he thought history would remember him. Göring smiled. In 50 or 60 years, there will be statues of Hermann Göring all over Germany. Little statues, maybe, but one in every German home. He said this not as a fantasy, but as a prediction. He expected to be executed. He had accepted that outcome, but he also believed he would be vindicated in the eyes of the German people. His legacy, not his life, was what mattered now. Göring's influence extended far beyond his cell. He was not just a prisoner awaiting judgment. He was shaping how the trial would unfold, preparing to transform the courtroom into his stage. A man who knew. He was being tested. Every psychological test is designed to reveal something the subject wants to hide. Defenses are supposed to crack under careful probing. The entire science of personality assessment rests on the assumption that the examiner holds the power. Hermann Göring reversed that assumption completely. From the first testing session, he treated the evaluation as a contest rather than an examination. He did not simply answer questions. He studied the questions. He analyzed what each test was measuring. He adjusted his responses to present exactly the image he wanted to project. During the Rorschach administration, he demonstrated acute awareness of the process. After providing his vivid, controlled responses to each inkblot, he made that telling comment about wishing the Luftwaffe had access to such testing techniques. He was simultaneously being evaluated and evaluating the tools being used on him. Kelley observed Göring's behavior across dozens of sessions. The pattern was always the same. Every answer redirected attention toward Göring's importance. Every response served his narrative. Every interaction became an opportunity to establish dominance. Each day when I came to his cell on my rounds, Kelley wrote, he would jump up from his chair, greet me with a broad smile and outstretched hand, escort me to his cot and pat its middle with his great paw. The warmth seemed genuine, but Kelley understood it was a performance designed to control the relationship. Göring made a request that illustrated just how completely he had read the situation. He asked Kelley to consider adopting his daughter Edda if both he and his wife died. This was not a casual remark. It was a calculated appeal to Kelley's emotions.
There are some people who, after a casual glance at this child, will label her a bad one, a potential criminal.
An attempt to create a bond that would transcend the professional relationship. When Kelley eventually left Nuremberg, Göring reportedly wept unashamedly. He offered Kelley a valuable ring as a parting gift. Kelley declined the ring, but accepted a signed portrait. Even in that exchange, Göring maintained control. He had positioned himself as the giver rather than the prisoner. Kelley recognized what was happening. He described Göring as undoubtedly the most ruthless human being I have ever experienced. But he also found himself impressed despite himself. The tests designed to expose cracks were instead confirming structure. Solid, functional, terrifying structure. A mind built for dominance. Charisma as a weapon. Douglas Kelley had studied charisma in textbooks. He understood the psychology of influence. But watching Hermann Göring operate was like watching a masterclass in manipulation. The technique was almost invisible. Göring never demanded anything. He never threatened. He simply adjusted his approach to each person he encountered until he found the frequency that worked. With guards, he was friendly. With interrogators, he was cooperative. With fellow defendants, he was commanding. With Kelley, he was intellectual. The effect on interrogators was particularly striking. American prosecutor Robert Jackson prepared for months to cross-examine Göring at trial. He expected to face a broken, defensive war criminal. Instead, he encountered a witness who understood English well enough to formulate answers during the translation delay. A witness who had memorized vast quantities of documentary evidence. A witness who corrected Jackson's pronunciation of German names with condescending precision. Jackson made a strategic error early in the cross-examination. He assumed that confronting Göring with evidence of German rearmament would force admissions of guilt. Göring's response was devastating. Of course we rearmed. I am only sorry we did not rearm more. There was no evasion, no denial, just flat acknowledgement, delivered with a hint of pride.
Göring had a slightly unusual upbringing, certainly as compared to the other Nazi leaders who were mainly lower middle-class origins.
Jackson had no response prepared for a defendant who freely admitted everything while refusing to concede wrongdoing. The confrontation grew worse. When Jackson claimed Germany had kept war preparations entirely secret from foreign powers, Göring struck back. "I do not think I can recall reading beforehand the publication of the mobilization plans of the United States." The courtroom erupted in laughter. An infuriated Jackson threw down his headphones. He became so bitter and defeated that he considered abandoning the cross-examination altogether. British Judge Sir Norman Burkitt wrote in his private diary that Göring revealed himself as a very able man who perceived the intent of every question almost as soon as it was uttered. He called Göring a supreme egoist and a consummate liar, but also a charming rogue. The British judge, who had seen countless criminals, seemed almost impressed despite himself. Charming. That word appeared again and again in accounts of people who dealt with Göring. Guards found it difficult to dislike him, despite knowing his brutal reputation. Interrogators, who should have maintained professional distance, found themselves engaged by his raw sense of humor. That pull was the most dangerous thing about him. It made people forget. It made them doubt. Kelley recognized this as manipulation refined through decades of wielding power. The danger was not resistance. Anyone could resist an obvious enemy. The danger was influence so smooth it went unnoticed, until you found yourself singing songs with a mass murderer and wondering how you got there. When two experts see different monsters. Douglas Kelley was not the only psychologist studying the Nazi defendants. Gustav Gilbert arrived at Nuremberg in October 1945. Gilbert was the son of Jewish Austrian immigrants. He had a PhD in psychology from Columbia. He spoke fluent German. The two men should have been natural collaborators. They initially planned to co-author a book about Nazi psychology. Instead, they produced one of the bitterest professional feuds in the history of psychology. The problem was simple. Kelley and Gilbert looked at the same evidence and reached opposite conclusions. Kelley saw Göring as a brilliant, brave, ruthless, shrewd executive, a man with a normal basic personality and marked egocentricity. Dangerous, certainly. Evil, arguably, but not psychologically abnormal. Gilbert saw something very different. He described Göring as an aggressive psychopath with an insatiable lust for power, titles, wealth, food, and ostentatious display, ready to murder, steal, or stage frame-ups to gain his ends. The disagreement went far beyond Göring. Kelley concluded that the Nazi defendants did not represent a specifically Nazi pathology. They were simply creatures of their environment, as all humans are. Their personalities could be duplicated in any country of the world today. Gilbert rejected this entirely. He argued the Nazis represented a unique category of psychopathology. They were monsters, not mirrors. The co-authored book never happened. Kelley withdrew from the agreement because he did not think they were on the same page. The professional relationship collapsed into what one biographer called a silly professional feud motivated by greed and academic ambition. Both men published separately. Kelley wrote 22 Cells in Nuremberg. Gilbert wrote Nuremberg Diary. Scholars have spent decades trying to determine whose interpretation was correct. In 1975, Rorschach expert Molly Harrower conducted an experiment that spoke directly to the dispute. She mixed Nazi Rorschach protocols with those of Unitarian ministers and psychiatric outpatients. Then she asked 10 expert interpreters to sort them. The experts could not distinguish Nazi responses from clergy responses better than random chance. The evidence seemed to support Kelley. The Nazis were not obviously different. Their test results did not scream monster. Their psychological profiles overlapped substantially with normal populations. The question of who was right mattered enormously. If Kelley was correct, then the capacity for atrocity existed in ordinary people everywhere. If Gilbert was correct, then the Nazis could be contained to a specific aberrant category, safely distant from normal human experience. Neither answer was comforting, but only one forced you to look in the mirror, and Kelley was certain the evidence supported his view. The verdict that followed. The Psychiatrist home. Douglas Kelley's final report delivered the verdict no one wanted to hear. Hermann Göring was legally sane, free of psychosis, fit for trial. His personality showed marked egocentricity and powerful emotional drives, but nothing that rose to the level of mental illness. He understood right and wrong. He simply did not care. Then Kelley added the sentence that haunted him for the rest of his life. They were not spectacular types, not personalities such as appear once in a century. Their like could very easily be found in America. The trial proceeded. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts came down. Guilty on all 4 counts. Death by hanging. Goring's only complaint was the method. He believed hanging was inappropriate for a man of his position. He requested a soldier's execution. The request was denied. The hangings were scheduled for October 16, 1946. On the night of October 15th, guards observed Goring in his cell, apparently sleeping. At approximately 10:45 p.m., a guard noticed his body twitching. They rushed in and found him writhing in agony. Glass shards and traces of cyanide were visible on his lips. He was dead within minutes. He had hidden a potassium cyanide capsule inside a brass cartridge. His suicide note explained that he had concealed multiple capsules since before his imprisonment, leaving one to be found during searches while keeping others hidden. A third capsule was later discovered in his toiletry case, tucked inside a jar of skin cream. Even in death, he had outmaneuvered his captors. What is known is how Douglas Kelley reacted. He did not call the suicide cowardly, as Justice Jackson did. Instead, he wrote that the suicide was a skillful, even brilliant, finishing touch, completing the edifice for Germans to admire in times to come. That phrase, skillful and brilliant, applied to the suicide of a man responsible for millions of deaths, tells you everything about Kelley's complicated relationship with his subject. Kelley returned to America and resumed his academic career. He became a professor of criminology at UC Berkeley. He gave public lectures warning about people who were like Nazis. His warnings grew more urgent over the years. Strong, dominant, aggressive, egocentric personalities like Goring could very easily be present in America. He specifically cited white supremacists using racism as a method of obtaining power.
Vision, he can't measure distance. Things look bigger or littler than normal. And if he takes enough, he gets hallucinations.
He pointed to anti-minority sentiment and restrictions on voting rights. Without checks on anti-democratic ideologies, he argued, the United States could transform into a Nazi-like state. The mechanisms of atrocity were human. He advocated for psychiatric examinations of anyone running for political office. He believed psychology could serve as an early warning system for society. But the warning system was ignored. No one particularly wanted to hear these warnings. Americans in the 1950s preferred to believe that Nazism was a German problem, a foreign disease that could never take root in their country. Kelley's message, that the monster was inside the house, was not welcome. On New Year's Day, 1958, Douglas Kelley was cooking dinner for his family at their home in Berkeley. Something went wrong. He burned himself and exploded in anger. His wife, his father, and his 3 children watched as he stormed upstairs to his study. Minutes later, he emerged holding a small capsule. He announced that he was going to swallow potassium cyanide and would be dead in 30 seconds. Then he put the capsule in his mouth and collapsed like a slackened marionette. His children watched their father die the same way Goring had died 12 years earlier. He was 45 years old. Biographer Jack L. High believes both men chose cyanide for the same reason. It was a dramatic way of making an exit and a way of making a statement while making that exit. For Goring, the statement was that the Americans would not control his destiny. For Kelley, the statement remains unclear. What is clear is that something from Nuremberg followed Kelley home. Some knowledge or burden that he carried for 12 years until it became unbearable. His son later joked that Kelley meeting Goring was like King Kong meeting Godzilla. Both were master manipulators, doing everything they could to get what they wanted from the other. Perhaps in that collision, something transferred, or perhaps Kelley simply understood too well the truth he had discovered in Cell 5. The Nazis were not mad. They were not aberrations. They were human beings who had been given power without accountability and had used it without restraint. Their like could be found anywhere. Their like could be found in anyone who combined overweening ambition with low ethical standards and strongly developed nationalism. That knowledge is not easy to carry. It means the Holocaust was not a malfunction, but a possibility. It means civilization's protections are thinner than we want to believe. It means the question is never whether monsters exist, but whether we recognize them in time. Douglas Kelley spent 12 years trying to make people understand this. Then, on a New Year's Day in Berkeley, he stopped trying. The most disturbing lesson from Nuremberg is not who Hermann Göring was. It is how familiar his traits remain. The charm that disarms suspicion, the ambition that justifies anything, the confidence that transforms cruelty into policy. Kelley saw this clearly, perhaps too clearly, and in the end, he chose to leave the same way his patient did, making a statement, taking control of his exit, leaving behind a warning that still echoes 8 decades later. The monster is not over there. The monster is in here, and the only protection is the willingness to see it. Douglas Kelley lies buried in California. Hermann Göring's ashes were scattered in a river to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. Neither man got the ending he probably wanted, but the questions they raised together remain unanswered. What makes someone capable of atrocity? How do we recognize the danger before it accumulates power? And what happens to those who stare too long into the darkness trying to understand? Kelley understood something most refuse to accept. The line between ordinary ambition and extraordinary evil is thinner than we want to believe. The same traits that make someone a successful leader can make someone a war criminal if the circumstances align and the constraints disappear. Every generation gets the chance to answer for itself. The tests are still being administered. What do you think Kelley truly uncovered behind those prison walls? Share your thoughts in the comments below.